I said to somebody earlier on, that's why I preach through books of the Bible. There's certain passages of the Bible you wouldn't necessarily just say, oh, I'm going to preach on that today. That sounds encouraging and uplifting, you know. And so James 5, 1-6. The first thing I thought of when I was working on this passage is going back to when I was a little younger. And those of you who are about my age know the group of ABBA. You know ABBA? You remember that song? They used to have a song, Money, 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 must be funny in a rich man's world. Remember that? Yeah. Oh, dear me. And, you know, people say that money isn't everything. You know, money can't buy you happiness. I've heard a quote actually from a number of different people. It goes like this: whoever said that money can't buy happiness doesn't know where to shop. No? And I throw that in there because, you know, we do have this tendency, even though we say, well, money can't buy happiness, and we'd all kind of nod our heads, but we keep going after money sometimes, you know. We keep going after needing more money and so on and so forth. Back in the 1980s, WKOX, the radio station in Chicago, Illinois, put out a challenge: the craziest thing that you would do to get $10,000. They had 6,000 people kind of apply, send in their crazy ideas of what they would do to get 10 grand. The guy who won it was a young man by the name of Jay Gwaltney. He said he'd eat a tree. Yeah, so he ate a 11-foot spruce sapling. It was 11 foot high, so it took him 18 hours over 3 days. He sat down with his tuxedo on and a pair of pruning shears, and he ate the whole thing all the way from the top little branches and the leaves down to the roots. All he used was he had some French dressing to go with it, and yeah. So people will do crazy things to get money, right? 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 9 says this: those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires, well, like eating a tree, that plunge people into ruin and destruction. But to say that money isn't important would be ridiculous. It would be to deny reality, right? We need money. We need money to live. We need money to put food on the table. We need money to buy homes and all the things that we need for life. One of the great heavyweight champions of the world, in fact, he is regarded as the greatest heavyweight champion of the world, a man by the name of Joe Louis. He's put it this way. He said, money isn't everything, but it sure helps calm the nerves. And it does, doesn't it? If you haven't got money, you know, you will go to extremes sometimes, just like this Jay Waltney, to get money. So when we read this little passage, it starts off in verse 1 of chapter 5. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Now, first of all, we say, well, who's he writing to, right? Because there's a chapter break in here, chapter 5. If you remember from what I was preaching on last week, there were no chapters and verses when this was written. It was a letter. It was a letter to the church. It was a letter to the people of the church. And so chapter 4 goes straight into chapter 5. And in fact, the passage I was reading last week begins in verse 13 with the same beginning. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to this city and spend a year there and carry on business and make money. Right? And he goes on to say that these people that were doing that had no thoughts for what God's will was. They just wanted their will. They were going to go to this city, that city, make money, and get rich. That's the context of this little passage in chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. James is speaking to those people who need money, want money, which kind of includes us all, but they have no desire for the will of God. They just want their will, and they want to get rich, right? And so we think to ourselves, well, that doesn't apply to me. I'm not rich. And most of us in this room, I don't think would classify ourselves as rich. And most of you probably online wouldn't classify yourselves necessarily as rich. In fact, I did a little bit of research this week. Canadians individually owe about $2.3 trillion. That's the personal debt of Canadians. Not this isn't the country. This is individuals, $2.3 trillion. Personal debt, not including mortgages, is $23,800 per person. Right? $23,800 per person, not including mortgages. And this one blew me away. The average Canadian owes $1.78 for every dollar that they earn. Ugh. That's going to take a long time to pay that off, isn't it? It's just not going to happen very easily, right? So when it comes to reading this little passage of Scripture, we're Canadians. We fall into this category of what we owe and so on. And many people would say, well, I'm in debt anyway. I'm not rich. Well, yes, you are. Because I was doing some study also, research on world poverty. And I found out that almost 1 billion people are living below the World Bank poverty line. Now, the poverty line in Canada is something around $35,000 a year for a family or something like that. It's the poverty line. Might be a bit higher than that now. The World Bank poverty line for globally is $1.90 per day. That's the World Bank. And there's 1 billion people in the world living below that. There's just about half the population of the planet, about 4 billion people, have a household income below $2.50 per day. $2.50. And we hear those kind of statistics, and we think to ourselves, well, I can't change the world. I mean, I can do nothing about those kind of numbers. And that's right. No, we can't. But I believe changing our attitudes towards money can go a long, long way to making a difference, even if it's just for one person in this world. And I believe God expects us to use what he has blessed us with to make a difference in the lives of others, in the lives of people who are needy. And then he says in verses 2 and 3, James says to the church, to people reading this letter, your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver have corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like a fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. One of the greatest examples of hoarding wealth was a man by the name of John G. Wendell. He was, before there was a Trump, there was a Wendell. Right? Wendell was the richest man in New York City. He inherited a lot of money along with his sisters, but he got more of it. He inherited a lot of money from his father, and along with his sisters, whose names were Rebecca, Augusta, Josephine, Henrietta, Georgina, Mary, and Ella. He had a bunch of them, a bunch of sisters and one guy. And they inherited all this money, but most of all, they inherited property. And by the time John G. Wendell actually passed away, he owned 150 properties in downtown Manhattan, which would be worth billions today. But during their time on the earth, while they lived, John G. Wendell didn't want to share any of his money. He didn't want any of it to be depleted, and so he convinced all but one of his sisters never to get married because he didn't want the money going anywhere. He refused to get married because he didn't want anyone else getting their hands on their money. One sister did get married, but she was in her mid-60s by the time that happened, and so didn't have any kids. And so he was okay with that, right? Because he didn't want that money to go anywhere else. On top of that, not only did he kind of convince his sisters not to marry, they had no electricity. He wouldn't put it in the house. He didn't change any of the furniture or anything like that. That would go down well, wouldn't it, ladies? Hey, not changing. There was no. He never went to Home Sense. I don't think it existed back then. And on top of that, they never bought any new clothes. By the time the last one died, who was Ella Wendell, she died wearing her dress that she had worn for the last 25 years. And by the way, she made it herself. That's the kind of hoarding that is beyond anything that we can possibly imagine. But you see what he says in here when it comes to hoarding? You have hoarded wealth in the last days. In other words, when it comes to a time when we are going to be judged by what we have done with what we have got, have we hoarded wealth? And in those days when James was writing, wealth wasn't classified with what is your net worth. It wasn't classified by how much you've got in the bank. No, it was worked out by what you owned in the way of grain and oil and stuff like that, what you had in the way of clothes and precious metals. And he says, your wealth has rotted. Your grain and your corn has rotted. He says, you've stored it up. You know, Jesus, we talked about it last week, the passage where Jesus talks about that wealthy farmer who stored everything up in barns. He says, you've stored it up and it's gone rotten. You've stored it for so long. Just like those chocolate bars maybe would have gone rotten if she'd kept on to them. Did you know, by the way, in Canada, every year, 2.2 million tons of food that is perfectly good, edible food, is thrown away at a value of $17 billion. The average family in Canada throws away 140 kilograms of food, edible food, every year at a value of $1,100 a year. He says, your clothes have been eaten by moths. You know, I don't know about you. Jill has... She's very good with me. She not only dresses me, she gets rid of clothes that I shouldn't keep, right? But because, you know, moths don't eat the clothes you're wearing. The moths will only eat the clothes that you kind of keep stored away for so long, right, and never wear them. I had a coat, a parka. I really liked it. It was a nice coat. You know, it's a down coat and all the rest, and it's a really warm winter coat. But I never wore it. And Jill said, well, you should get rid of it. I said, well, I like it. I said, but when was the last time you wore it? I said, well, I don't think I ever wear it. Hey, before you start laughing at me, check your own closets, okay? And so she said, and then she said this, you could give that to second time around and somebody who needs it could use it. Oh, yeah, it's gone. Hasn't it? That's gone, hasn't it? Yeah, she's nodding, I think. Some stuff disappears I know nothing about, but that's good, right? Because this is the kind of things, what are we doing with what we've got, right? He says, your gold and silver have corroded. Now, we know that precious metals don't corrode. The word that is used there can also be used of tarnishing. And James is giving the idea that you've stored up all this money and you're just keeping it there, just like the Wendells, but maybe not to that degree. But are you using it? It's gone tarnished because it's not being put into use. What are we doing with what we have got? He said, and then he says in verse 4, look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. I want to encourage you, if you are a business owner or you have some kind of work that you do where you employ somebody else, or maybe you just have to pay someone to do something, don't be a cheapskate. Be generous. Don't kind of try and make money on the backs of them. They're working for you. That's what kind of James is saying. If you're a Christian, God has blessed you. God has blessed you so much that you should be prepared to bless somebody else with what he has given you. And then he says in verse 5, you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. Wow. I mean, these are harsh words, aren't they? I mean, probably all of us in this room, probably all of us live watching online, would think of ourselves, certainly in comparison to those 4 billion people that have $2.50 a day, are living in luxury and self-indulgence. God doesn't say you can't be rich. In fact, as we read through the Bible, he made a lot of people rich. People like in the Old Testament, Abraham, Job, David, Solomon, he made them rich. In the New Testament, we see people like Joseph of Arimathea, Barnabas, Lydia, were all well-to-do people. God had blessed them so much. But what are we doing with what God has given us? In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 18 says this, remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. I love that verse because it really starts to put it in perspective. God doesn't kind of condemn making money. He doesn't condemn kind of getting wealthy even. He says, just remember that it was actually God who gave you the ability to make that money. Therefore, going back to what he said in chapter 4, at the end of chapter 4 that we talked about last week, what is his will for how you're to spend it? Make sure you've asked him. Don't just go and spend it on whatever you want to spend it on, or do with it whatever you think you should do, with no thought for what God's will is. As he said in chapter 4, what is your life? You're a mist that appears today for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. You know, so we should be asking God what is his will for these things. I love a story that Tony Campolo tells about a time when he was flying back from to Philadelphia. He had been speaking on the West Coast, and he flew back to Philadelphia, which is where he lives. And he would, not so much now, he's getting to be a lot older now, but he used to speak in a lot of different places. And he had just taken the red eye from the West Coast and arriving in the airport at Philadelphia at 8:30 in the morning. And when he got there, his secretary was there to meet him. She said, Tony, I am very sorry. I had forgotten that you have an appointment at 10 o'clock to speak in a church. And I don't know how I missed it, but I forgot to tell you about it. And I'm here to take you to that church. It's a World Day of Prayer meeting, and you're to speak about missions. The only thing that Tony wanted to do was sleep. He hadn't been able to sleep on the plane all the way across. He was feeling miserable. He just wanted to get into bed. But he got to the church, and he sat there, and he waited, and they did their presentation, and the lady who was leading the service, they came to the offering time, and she said to him, started talking about one of the missionaries that they support. This missionary was a lady, a doctor, who lived in Venezuela and had given her whole life to helping the poor in Caracas in Venezuela. And so at the appropriate time, the lady said to Dr. Campolo, could you pray for the offering? This lady needs $5,000 in order to build an extension to her practice because she hasn't got enough room for all the sick. And Tony Campolo said, before I realized what was even coming out of my mouth, because I wasn't really myself, he said. I said, no, I won't. He said, we'll just take up an offering of everything that we've got in our pockets, and I'll put everything I've got in my pocket on the offering plate, then every single one of us we won't write checks or anything like that, just what cash you've got, we'll just put it on the offering plate. And the leader of the meeting said, I think we've got the point. And he said, no, I don't think you have. I'm putting my money on the offering right now. He said, this was a good time to do this because actually all I had was $2.50, $2.25 actually, in my pocket. So I put my $2.25 on the plate, and he pointed to the lady who was the leader and said, now it's your turn. And she just looked at him. Eventually, she kind of took out a wallet, and she must have just gone to the bank because she had $110 in her wallet and put it on there. And she said, okay, so now we've got $112.25. You're next. And that person kind of tentatively came up. And one by one, he started to point to people. He said, it took me 25 minutes to take the offering. He said, by the time it all came in, we counted it, and we had $8,000. He said, and I know we didn't have it all because some people came and put their money up there, and they just glared at me. But by the time it all came in, we had $8,000. And he said, isn't it incredible that God would do such a thing? He said, we have the nerve to pray and ask God to provide for this missionary when he already has. He's already given us what we have. The problem is, he said, it's already in our pockets, just in our pockets. Hoarding wealth in the last days. And then he says in verse 6, you have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. There's debate as to what he's talking about there, because certainly in those days it was the rich who oppressed the Christians. It was the rich religious leaders who caused the death of Jesus himself and eventually would cause the death of the very writer of this letter, James, and all the other apostles. But I think also it shows unconcern. When we have unconcern, when we have little regard for those who are below that world poverty line, when we have little concern for those who are struggling to the point that people are dying? Do you realize that 9 million people die of hunger or hunger-related diseases every year? 9 million. That's more than AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis combined. A child dies of hunger or hunger-related disease every 10 seconds. And so in the time that I preach this message, 180 kids will die of hunger or hunger-related disease. You see, that's the money trap. That's the trap that Timothy talked about in 1 Corinthians 6. We get caught looking out only for ourselves, I should say, and not for the needs of others. 1 Timothy 6, verse 10 says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." But there is good news. You see, God has given us principles for what to do with our money, with our possessions, and with our wealth. And the first thing that we have to realize when it comes to that issue, that topic, is what it tells us in 1 Chronicles 29, that everything that we have comes from you, O Lord. Everything that we have comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. And so what he's saying is that when we give to the poor, when we help our neighbor, when we come alongside that person who is in need, when we do something special in that way, really all we're doing is giving what God has given to us. We have to first of all recognize if we're going to have a change of attitude when it comes to money and how we handle money and wealth and possessions, the first thing that has to change is, and the first thing we have to realize is that it all comes from God. Everything that I have, first of all, comes from him. He is the one that blesses us. We have a man in our church. I'm not going to give you his name. Some of you will know who it is when I say it. But I don't want to embarrass him. But I know that he carries around in his wallet $100. Now, in these days, no one takes money, but he tries to carry around in his wallet all the time $100, because then if he comes across anyone who's in any kind of need, in anything in their life, that he can help them out and give them $100. When I first heard that, which was a number of years ago now, wow, that really kind of touched my heart and made me realize that's an attitude that I need to have, that we need to have. That everything we have comes from God. I am just a steward of God's resources to help others in their time of need. So secondly, first of all, everything comes from God. So give from your heart because of what Christ has done for you. Secondly, use your resources to make a difference. Pray and ask God for that opportunity to make a difference in somebody's life. You know what it says in Matthew chapter 6, in the passage that is generally known as the Sermon on the Mount? He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust destroy." That's exactly what James is talking about, isn't it? He said, "And where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there is your heart also." Lay up treasure in heaven. How do we do that? So this week, as I mentioned, I try to have verses that I try to memorize, and the one I've been using this week is from Matthew 25. "I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you healed me. I was in prison, and you came and visited me." You see, it's not just about money. It's about our whole attitude to the way in which we've been blessed. How we use our time, how we use our possessions, how we use that which God has blessed us with so that we can come alongside others and bless others. And you know what Jesus said then? He said, "Inasmuch as you have done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me." That's what it says in Proverbs. "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done." Most of us know the story of George Mueller. I want to tell it you again. It's very brief, but I want to look at it from a slightly different perspective. George Mueller was a man in England who started a number of different orphanages. By the way, he also started about 112 schools and taught 120,000 kids Christian education. But during his lifetime, he took care of about just over 10,000 orphans. And on one particular occasion, most of you know the story, on one particular occasion when they had no food in the house, he brought all the kids into the cafeteria, so to speak, into the refectory, and had them all sit down and pray. And asked the blessing on the food that God was going to provide, even though he knew that there was no food. There was nothing for them to eat and nothing for them to drink. But when the children had all prayed and George Mueller had prayed, shortly after that, the baker knocked on the door. And he said, God woke me up in the middle of the night and wanted me to bake bread for the kids. And so I spent the night baking bread for the kids, and he brought it in. And then a milk truck broke down just outside the gates to the orphanage, and he didn't want his milk to be spoiled, and so he brought all the milk into the orphanage, so it wasn't wasted, so that the kids would have something to drink. And when we think about that story, we often think about the faith that George Mueller had to have those kids sit down and pray and just believe that God would provide for them, and that absolutely is right. But what about the baker? That's who I want to concentrate on just for a moment right now. Because God spoke to that baker. He maybe didn't have the money, but he had the resource to make some bread. And God spoke to him in the middle of the night, Mr. Baker, get up and make some bread for these kids. I want you to do it now. And he might have argued with God, I don't know, but he went and made that bread to make a difference in those poor kids who were orphans. So use your resources to make a difference. Ask God how you can do that. Ask him for him to give you the opportunity to make a difference in the life of someone. Do that every day. He might not give you that opportunity every day, but we need to have our eyes open. Just like that man who has the money in his wallet for that opportunity that comes along to make a difference in somebody's life. And the third principle I just want to share is this: be content. Be content with the situation that God has put you in. Whether you are rich or poor, doesn't matter. God knows exactly where you are. He understands. And he will still use you to bless others, no matter how much or how little you have. In fact, one of the greatest stories in the Bible is found in Mark chapter 12, where the story is told of Jesus with his disciples in the temple. And everyone is putting their money in the offerings. And some people, it says, some rich people put huge amounts. And then along came this poor widow who had just 2 halfpennies, not even pennies, and threw them into the offering. And Jesus said this about that woman: truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. What does it say? She put more in that treasury. You see, God, the way God judges doesn't judge by how much you do, how much you give, how much resources, how much bread you bake, but where does it come from? He looks at our heart. Do we have a heart to give, a heart to be generous, a heart to make a difference in the lives of people who need it the most? Because that's where God's heart is at. And we know the story of this widow. We've known it's been talked about for 2,000 years. And will continue to be talked about because she gave from her heart. Let us pray. Lord, thank you for the blessings that you have poured out on us. We are blessed in so many ways. With the resources that we have, with the money that we have, with our abilities, with our possessions, with our talents. Lord, help us to use those things for your glory and to touch the lives of others. Lord, some can do it in a financial way and some people can't. They can do it in other ways. Even this poor widow made a huge difference that is still being talked about today. Lord, change our hearts, change our attitudes, that we might have a heart that is given to you first and then given to those who are in need. In Jesus' name, amen.